We're gonna die! So the Transition Spur is a familiar face on the channel, but it's been about 4 years since we last talked about it. So today Transition made a couple of updates to the Spur, including UDH compatibility, so you can run a T-type drivetrain, and we've got some cool new colors. Well, this isn't a complete overhaul. The Spur may not really have needed one. Even after 4 years, the Spur is still at the sharp end for the category. So stick around, see if we still love it after all these years. First of all, I'm a very different rider than I was 4 years ago. My neck is significantly less broken than the first time I reviewed this bike, riding a bit faster, a little bit more aggressively. So really, I'm just curious to see if I like the Spur as much as I did back then. Also, God bless Transition for keeping that rear brake line externally routed. I will die on this hill. All of your arguments for an internally routed rear brake line are invalid. So the big question the last time around for me was, is the Spur an XC bike or a trail bike? This time around, I don't think that's a question anymore. I don't think the new version dabbles with XC at all. I think it's a trail bike through and through. Since then, the build kit has changed a little bit. It now comes with a Fox 34 instead of the SID, which was way more XC. And this bike has a short, stubby little stem, really wide riser bars. It's got solid tires and a nice long dropper post, which all of that to me says trail, not XC. That said, it's still a pretty light bike for the category and for bikes these days that seem to be getting heavier and heavier. This bike weighs 27.1 pounds in extra large. That's not XC bike light, but it's also respectable and fairly light for the trail category. Apart from physically being light, it rides light, meaning the suspension feels pretty quick and pretty snappy, so does the handling, and it pedals pretty well. It still has that snappy feel when you get on the pedals. I think this bike is happy to do long slogs over the course of an entire day, and it's pretty happy to do those quick little stabby sprints. Sure, there are more efficient bikes in the category, thinking of the Rocky Mountain Element and the Giant Trance 29, but there are also slower bikes, thinking of the Tallboy. And I think this kind of ends up being pretty close to like the Orbea Occam SL and the Ibis Ripley. Efficiency isn't everything on the climbs though. Sometimes you're going to want a little bit of traction and a little bit of give for when climbs get loose, steep, and bumpy. The Spur has a bit of that comfort on offer. It's not as comfortable as the Tallboy. It's probably why it climbs a little bit quicker, but it's more comfortable than the Element and the Trance X. And I think it's because it finds a pretty solid middle ground between kind of that active, very high traction feel and a quicker, snappier, more efficient pedaling platform. And then in terms of traction specifically, it is again a similar story. Not as much as the Tallboy, more than the Element and Trance. Kind of falls in the middle. So overall, the Spur is still up there at the top of the class for climbing for me when you combine all of the factors. It might not be the best at any one given factor when you're thinking about climbing, but combine them all and it averages out probably a little bit better than most bikes in the category. Now, talking about the downhill, let's give the Spur a big old pat on the back. Even after 4 years, it still hangs with all the other trail bikes, even ones that have been updated or released a lot more recently. It is still a hell of a lot of fun and extremely capable for a 120mm bike. It is actually one of the few 120mm bikes that I wouldn't be too nervous about taking it down Grafton Mesa. Sure, it can do that, but I'd argue that's not really what it's designed to do. It's not gonna be perfect in that situation. It's designed to be a trail bike. It's designed to ride a wide variety of terrain. It's designed to ride blues and black diamonds and to be jibby and fun and lively and easy to move around. And in that kind of terrain, that is where you get the most out of it. So the Spur likes hopping and popping over trail obstacles. It makes riding that type of terrain really fun because you can just goof around and play around on the trail the entire time. It's very easy to unweight, get it off the ground, bunny hop over a rock or up a ledge or whatever is in your way. You can kind of just go over it instead of through it. By nature, it's not going to be super good at going through rough, chattery terrain. It's a small travel bike And I mean, the tires alone should tell you that it's not meant to plow through everything. I've been informed that here in Utah, we have some pretty fast, wide open terrain. So that's what I'm used to. That's the lens that I judge a bike through, and that's how I'm looking at the Spur. So I ended up preferring the Spur in slower speed terrain, like our desert mesa stuff, the twisty, windy, wiggly trails. That's where I liked it more, where there's more opportunities to jump and goof around and jib. That's where I liked the bike more rather than the flat out high speed trails. And I liked the bike in that slow speed terrain because the bike really facilitates that type of riding. It makes it more fun and easy to do, where it doesn't love the high speed stuff quite as much. Sure, if the trail's smooth, great. It's game on. The Spur's gonna do a great job. It's when you're doing 25 miles an hour and you hit a really rough, rocky, chunky, ledgy section, that's where you're going to be rethinking your life choices. So in some high-speed G-outs and while pumping into corners, I did notice a bit of frame flex. For reference, I weigh about 200 pounds, I'm a bigger guy, and I could get the frame to flex a little bit. It's kind of a double-edged sword. That frame flex is a little bit of what takes the sting out of trails in that chatter and through some of the rocky stuff. A little bit of that give is helpful. On the other side of that coin, when you pump into a corner really hard or hit a compression really hard, you can get the frame to flex just a little bit. And it comes across as the bike kind of winding up and then springing back. And sometimes that's a little bit unpredictable. It's not something I encountered often, and I actually really only encountered it when I was doing things to a 120 mil bike that you probably shouldn't, or that they weren't really made to do. So all in all, the Spur is a very fun, lively, exciting bike to ride. And it's every bit as capable as I remember it being. In fact, as I've changed as a rider, I think it's more fun now than it was to me back then. I care a little bit less about being the first guy to the bottom of the hill these days. I do like to go fast in sections, but I also like to goof around and enjoy my time out on the trail. Not worried about racing, and I think it really facilitates that type of riding. Let's talk about a couple of comparisons here. The first one I want to compare this to is the Orbea Occam SL, and it's a bit of a weird one. The Occam SL has 20 millimeters more travel than the Spur, but they end up riding pretty similarly. The Occam SL is one of those bikes that climbs better than you'd expect it, and then the Spur is one of those bikes that descends better than you'd expect it, so they kind of end up meeting in the middle. They weigh about the same, climb about the same, and descend about the same. The biggest difference for me comes in the handling characteristics downhill. The Occam SL feels a bit more sporty and a little quicker to steer, a little firmer off the top, while the Spur, on the other hand, feels a bit more plush off the top, yet not as deep for those bigger hits. And even though their geometry and stack heights are fairly similar, the cockpit setup on the Spur does sit up higher and a little bit wider and a little more trail, while the one on the Occam SL is a little more XC with a flat bar that's a little bit narrower. I know those are easy things to change, but it's worth talking about these bikes in their stock settings, especially when you figure at some point you're going to run out of steerer tube to get those bars higher and higher. That taller, more trail feeling cockpit on the Spur does maybe lend to a bit more confidence on the downhill, especially when things get steep because your weight's a little bit further back or less pulled forward over the front of the bike. So let's also talk about the Spur versus the Santa Cruz Tallboy. In fact, I've done a video comparing these two directly. It was a full video, it was very long. Maybe go watch that after this, because most of that assessment remains the same. The Tallboy has since been updated, hasn't been a huge update, little refinement. The Spur is the same Spur from that video. The big takeaway is that the Tallboy prefers descending, and the Spur prefers a little bit more balance between uphill and downhill. The Spur is the clear winner on the climbs in almost every aspect, except for maybe rear wheel traction, where the Tallboy is going to beat it. The Tallboy is clearly the more aggressive descender. It is slacker, it's a little bit longer. The suspension, though, is way more plush and bottomless. And then the frame is a little bit stiffer. So that little bit of frame flex I didn't encounter on the Tallboy. And all of those things lead to a bike that can be pushed harder on the descents. So when you get into terrain where you're above your category or into that rougher, gnarlier stuff, the Tallboy is going to be a little bit more comfortable than the Spur will. But in more balanced terrain where you're actually going to be getting the most out of both of these bikes, I think the Spur might be a little bit more well-rounded option. So now let's talk about the Rocky Mountain Element. And that bike is actually really unique, where it almost has all mountain geometry, but the suspension platform is a lot more XC. It is ultra quick and ultra snappy on the pedals. At the end of the day, it accomplishes the same task that the Spur accomplishes, but it goes about it in a completely different way. The Spur feels a lot more plush and active, while also being a bit more playful and fun. I think because that suspension's a little bit easier to get into. The Element, on the other hand, is more efficient, it's faster uphill, and it's a little bit less forgiving on the descents. Sure, the geometry provides a lot of stability at speed. It's helpful in steep, rough, chunky stuff, but the suspension just doesn't back it up or give you as much comfort and confidence as the suspension on the Spur does. So who is the Spur best suited for? Let's maybe start by eliminating a category. It's not for the XC racer. It might be able to do that job okay, but it's not perfect or optimal for that job. Instead, it's more for the rider who likes to climb, traverse, descend, jump, play, and just ride their bike. In the trail category, I kind of see two groups of bikes. You got the 120 mil bikes like the Spur, the Ripley, the Tallboy, and then you've got what we used to call all mountain bikes like the Hightower, the Ripmo, the SB140. I think all of those now are just kind of trail bikes, where the bigger ones tend to skew a little bit more towards downhill performance while still being capable climbers and being able to go for long days and go anywhere. Then you've got the smaller bikes that are a bit more balanced. They'll still probably tackle the same terrain on the downhills as those bigger 140 mil bikes, albeit slower, but then they're going to shine a bit more on the climbs and on those long days and on the traversy, pedally, rolly terrain. And the Spur falls into that second category. So if you want a trail bike that's going to cover the whole spectrum of trails that you'll ever ride, but you're more on the traversy, climby, rolly terrain than you are the big jumps, gnarly double black diamonds, this is probably right up your alley. Well, thanks for sticking around. See you next time.